I was examining census records from rural Pennsylvania when I noticed something peculiar. The 1790 census for Bradford County listed household sizes that didn't make demographic sense. Multiple entries showed households with 7 to 9 occupants, but property tax assessments indicating structures far too large for typical family dwellings. Homes assessed at sizes equivalent to small institutional buildings. I cross-referenced with local property records and found architectural plans from the period showing residential structures with ceiling heights of 12 to 14 feet on the ground floor and doorways measuring 8 feet tall. Standard construction for the period used 7-foot ceilings and 6.5-foot doorways. These weren't public buildings or churches, these were homes. And by 1820, they had all been demolished or drastically renovated with new, smaller doorways, cut into existing frames and ceilings lowered with false construction. The original inhabitants had disappeared from census records, no death records explaining the population loss, no migration records showing where they went, just architectural evidence of people who required dramatically larger living spaces and then suddenly didn't exist anymore. The pattern becomes clearer when you examine building records across the Northeast and Midwest from the late 1700s through the early 1800s. In upstate New York, municipal records from Albany show permits issued between 1785 and 1805 for residential construction with specifications listing doorway heights of 9 to 10 feet and ceiling heights of 13 to 15 feet. And these permits describe the structures as family dwellings, not commercial or institutional buildings. The buildings were constructed, occupied, and then systematically modified or demolished between 1810 and 1830. Architectural surveys from the 1960s noted the presence of unusually proportioned original door frames in several buildings that survived from the period. Door frames that had been reduced in size through later modifications, but showed evidence of original heights far exceeding standard construction. In Ohio, settlement records from the Western Reserve between 1800 and 1820 describe land parcels being cleared and structures built with uncommon dimensions suited to the stature of the first families. Those families vanished from tax rolls by 1825, and the structures were either torn down or sold to new occupants, who immediately undertook major renovations reducing interior dimensions. Consider the burial records. Church cemeteries across Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and Michigan contain graves from the late 1700s and early 1800s that show unusual characteristics. The graves are longer than standard, 8 to 9 feet in length rather than the typical 6 feet. Cemetery surveys note these oversized graves but attribute them to generous plot allocation or regional burial customs. But the graves cluster in specific time periods. They appear in records between 1780 and 1820 and then cease. Modern graves in the same cemeteries follow standard dimensions. What changed? Official records don't say. The graves themselves were never exhumed for study. They're simply noted in surveys as architectural curiosities. But when you map the locations of these oversized graves, they correspond precisely with the locations where residential structures with unusually large dimensions were constructed and then demolished. The correlation is exact. Families living in houses requiring 12-foot ceilings were buried in graves requiring 8-foot lengths, and both the houses and the families disappeared from records within the same narrow time window. The demographic collapse is visible in population records if you know what to look for. Multiple counties across the Midwest show unexplained population decreases between 1810 and 1830 that don't correspond with any documented migration, epidemic, or conflict. Warren County, In Pennsylvania, lost 17% of its recorded population between 1810 and 1820, with no corresponding death records and no recorded migration to other counties or territories. Gauga County, Ohio, showed similar losses. So did multiple counties in upstate New York. These weren't regions experiencing economic decline that would prompt migration. They were areas of active settlement and growth. The population should have been increasing. Instead, specific demographic segments simply vanished from records. And when you examine which households disappeared, they're consistently the ones associated with property records showing unusually large residential structures. Standard-sized households remained in census records. Households requiring oversized dwellings disappeared. Now expand the geographic lens. And because this pattern isn't limited to the American Northeast and Midwest. In Ireland, estate records from the late 1700s describe tenant cottages built with excessive proportions to accommodate families of unusual stature. These records appear in multiple counties including Antrim, Down, and Donegal. The cottages were occupied through the early 1800s and then abandoned en masse between 1815 and 1830. Estate managers noted the abandonment, but provided no explanation for it. The families simply left, and the oversized cottages were torn down or converted to other uses. In Scotland, similar patterns appear in Highland clearance records, but these weren't clearances driven by landlords converting to sheep farming. These were voluntary abandonments of properties specifically noted for unusual construction dimensions. The families inhabiting these properties disappeared from Kirk records. No more baptisms, marriages, or burials recorded after approximately 1820. In Scandinavia, parish records from rural Norway and Sweden show the same phenomenon. Families associated with farmsteads built with unusually large doorways and high ceilings vanished from records between 1810 and 1825. The farmsteads were either demolished or sold to new families, who immediately undertook renovations to reduce interior dimensions. What makes this demographic collapse particularly revealing is the institutional response to it. There was no response. No government inquiries into why entire demographic segments were disappearing. No medical investigations into potential epidemics. No documentation of where these populations migrated. And the disappearance was simply accepted and then ignored. Census records show population decreases but offer no explanations. Property records show building demolitions but don't explain why sound structures were being torn down. Church records show gaps in family lines but make no note of what caused the discontinuity. The absence of institutional concern is itself evidence, because demographic collapses of this scale normally trigger some form of official response. Disease outbreaks get documented, migrations get recorded, deaths get entered into registers. This disappearance triggered nothing, as if institutions knew exactly what was happening and had no interest in creating documentation about it. The timeline becomes crucial when you examine it closely. The bulk of the disappearances occurred between 1810 and 1830, show with the heaviest concentration between 1815 and 1825. This period follows immediately after the so-called Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the War of 1812 in North America. These conflicts involved massive military mobilizations and extensive combat across multiple continents. Official histories framed them as conventional wars between nation-states. But what if that framing is incomplete? What if these conflicts served an additional purpose beyond the territorial and political objectives described in historical accounts? The timing is too precise to be coincidental. Large-scale military operations end, and immediately afterward, a specific demographic segment vanishes from records across multiple countries. Families requiring oversized dwellings disappear. Buildings constructed to accommodate people of exceptional stature are demolished. The oversized graves stop appearing in cemetery records, all within the same 20-year window following major military conflicts. Consider what military records from the period actually show. Casualty lists from Napoleonic campaigns include numerous entries noting soldiers of exceptional stature or uncommonly large proportions. These entries appear consistently through 1812, but decrease dramatically after 1815. By 1820, they've essentially disappeared from military documentation. Where did these soldiers come from? Recruitment records don't specify. They're simply listed among general infantry without notation of origin, but their presence in military forces is documented, and then their disappearance from subsequent military records is equally documented. The same pattern appears in British military records, and in Prussian military archives, in American militia rosters. Soldiers of unusual size appear in records through the War of 1812 and then vanish from documentation by the 1820s. Not because military record keeping changed, the formats remain consistent. Because that population stopped appearing in military ranks. The architectural evidence provides additional confirmation. Barracks constructed during the Napoleonic era show unusual design features. Door frames taller than standard military construction, ceiling heights that exceed functional requirements for typical soldiers, bunk dimensions that suggest accommodation of larger than average personnel. These design features appear in military structures built between 1800 and 1815 across multiple countries. They don't appear in military construction after 1820. The renovation records show many of these barracks being modified in the 1820s and 1830s, with doorways reduced, ceilings lowered, and bunks rebuilt to standard dimensions. The modifications were systematic, occurring across different military branches and different nations within the same time period. Something changed about the personnel these facilities needed to accommodate. And that change coincided exactly with the disappearance of civilian populations requiring oversized residential structures. What this suggests is a coordinated demographic transition occurring across multiple continents within a compressed time frame. A population requiring specialized architecture, larger doorways, higher ceilings, longer graves, that was present in records through the early 1800s and then systematically removed from documentation by 1830. And the removal wasn't accidental population decline. The architectural modifications were too deliberate. The timing across different regions was too synchronized. The lack of institutional documentation about the disappearance was too complete. This was managed transition. Populations were either removed, relocated, or eliminated, and then all evidence of their existence was minimized in official records. The oversized buildings were demolished or modified. The demographic gaps in census records were left unexplained. The presence of unusually proportioned soldiers in military forces was scrubbed from subsequent documentation. Within a single generation, a distinct population that required different physical accommodations had been erased from historical visibility. And we can see where the erasure was less complete. In regions with less centralized record keeping, evidence survived. Remote parishes in Scotland and Norway maintained records that weren't systematically purged. Small-town cemeteries in the American Midwest preserved oversized graves that no one thought to excavate and remove. Architectural surveys in the 20th century documented anomalous building proportions before understanding their significance. The evidence exists in fragments: a grave that's too long, a door frame that's too tall, a population decrease that's unexplained, a military record noting soldiers of exceptional stature that then vanishes from subsequent documentation. No single piece is conclusive. But the accumulation creates an undeniable pattern. A population existed that required physical accommodations, exceeding standard human proportions, and that population was demographically significant enough to appear in census records, property records, military rosters, and cemetery logs. And then, within 2 decades, following major military conflicts, that population disappeared from documentation, while the physical infrastructure built to accommodate them was systematically demolished or modified. The implications extend beyond simple demographic history. If a population of exceptional stature existed through the early 1800s and then vanished from records, what happened to them? Mass death would leave documentary evidence, burial records, epidemic reports, casualty lists. Mass migration would leave trail evidence, property sales, border crossings, settlement records in destination regions. Neither pattern exists. The disappearance is too clean, and it suggests removal rather than natural demographic decline. Populations were identified, segregated, and eliminated from the historical record with enough thoroughness that by the mid-1800s, their prior existence had been effectively erased from institutional memory. The buildings they lived in were gone. The graves marking their burials were explained away as architectural anomalies. The military records documenting their service were scrubbed from archives. Within 50 years, an entire demographic segment had been removed from history so completely that suggesting they existed at all now seems implausible. What this means is we're looking at evidence of systematic demographic elimination coordinated across multiple nations within a specific time window. And the architectural modifications weren't random renovations driven by changing tastes. They were deliberate erasures of physical evidence that a different population once inhabited these structures. The cemetery records weren't careless about grave dimensions. They documented a population that required longer burial spaces, and then that population ceased to exist in burial records. The census gaps weren't administrative errors. They marked the removal of specific households from demographic documentation. This wasn't natural population change. This was managed disappearance executed with enough coordination that the same patterns appear in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and in Ireland, in New York, and in Norway, all within the same 2-decade window. That the evidence suggests we've inherited a historical narrative that's been carefully edited, a narrative that removed an entire demographic segment and then erased most traces of that removal. What we're left with are fragments, oversized door frames that survived demolition, graves that were too remote to excavate, census records with unexplained gaps, military rosters with references to soldiers of unusual stature that then vanish. The fragments are enough to see the outline of what was removed. A population that was present, documented, and then systematically erased from institutional records, while the physical infrastructure they required was demolished or modified to eliminate evidence of their existence. We're living with the results of that erasure, and in a historical timeline that's been sanitized to remove uncomfortable evidence of human diversity that didn't fit approved models. So we're left with oversized graves in rural cemeteries that no one thought to question. Architectural surveys noting door frames too tall for standard human proportions without investigating why they were built that way. Census records showing unexplained population decreases that historians ignored because they didn't fit conventional demographic models. Military records with tantalizing references to soldiers of unusual stature that then vanish from subsequent documentation. Property records showing systematic demolition of residential structures specifically noted for excessive dimensions, all occurring within the same narrow time window following major military conflicts, and all concentrated in the same geographic regions, all creating the same pattern of a distinct population that was present in early 1800s records and then disappeared by 1830. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why was their disappearance so thoroughly scrubbed from institutional documentation? And what does it mean that we're only now beginning to recognize the evidence they left behind? Evidence that survived only because the erasure wasn't quite complete enough to eliminate every trace.